when a homeless kid shouted, "Don't eat that," no one could have predicted what would happen next. The John Cafe, a magnet for the city's elite, was nestled between rows of manicured trees and the gentle hum of a nearby fountain. It was midday, and the cafe was alive with energy. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided gracefully between tables, balancing trays of artisan dishes and freshly brewed coffee. The air carried the warm aroma of freshly baked bread and a faint sweetness from blooming flowers. But for one man, none of this grandeur seemed remarkable. At a prime table in the center sat Karl Marx, a name synonymous with power and wealth. He had built his empire from the ground up, starting with real estate in his 20s and expanding into ventures most couldn't even fathom. Now, at 70, he exuded the confidence of a man who not only owned his world, but likely controlled those of everyone around him. Dressed in a sharp suit and gold-rimmed glasses, he was the picture of affluence. Yet, as he scanned the menu, his movements were slow, almost hesitant. Opposite him sat Candy, his much younger wife, a woman who looked like she'd stepped off the cover of a glossy magazine. Her jet-black hair framed a face of impossible perfection, and her bright red lipstick was immaculately applied. Every inch of her exuded elegance, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. She absent-mindedly twirled a diamond bracelet on her wrist, her attention more on her phone screen than her husband. Nearby, a boy lingered just beyond the patio fence. He was small for his age, his oversized hoodie hanging loosely on his thin frame. His dark eyes darted from table to table, scanning plates and pockets, seeking opportunity. His name was Josh, though no one in the cafe knew it. He was a familiar face on this street, a kid with nowhere to go, always on the fringes of conversations and the edges of concern. Carl glanced at his watch, his tone calm but firm. "You're distracted again." Candy looked up, her practiced smile betraying no warmth. "I'm right here," she replied sweetly, reaching across the table to place her hand on his. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches." Josh's stomach growled. He edged closer, his footsteps almost silent as he leaned against the patio railing. His gaze locked on Carl's table, where a pristine white bowl of soup sat alongside fresh bread and a glass of water. It was the kind of meal he hadn't seen up close in months. Then something unusual happened. As Carl adjusted his glasses and picked up his phone, Candy's hand slipped into her designer handbag. Josh watched as her fingers closed around a small vial. With a practiced flick, she twisted it open and tilted it over the steaming bowl. The liquid blended into the soup instantly, disappearing without a trace. Josh's breath caught. He froze, his wide eyes fixed on her as she casually stirred the soup with a spoon, her expression unchanged. Leaning closer to Carl, she spoke in a low voice, her words just loud enough to carry. "After all the trouble I've gone through, you won't ruin this now." Josh blinked, unsure of what he had just witnessed. Could it be real? Could a woman so polished, sitting in a place so refined, really be doing what he thought she was? But a gnawing sense of dread anchored him in place. Something was very, very wrong. His heart pounded as he crouched lower, behind the railing, his mind racing. No one else had noticed, no one else had been paying attention. It was just him. The faint growl in his stomach tried to pull him back to reality, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the couple. Carl looked tired and distracted, his spoon hovering over the bowl as he glanced at his phone. Candy, by contrast, was all charm and poise once more. Her bright smile returned, and her hand rested lightly on her chin as though she hadn't whispered something chilling just moments ago. Josh could feel the weight of a decision pressing down on him. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. Why get involved? Who would believe a kid like him, a boy in a threadbare hoodie, standing on the outskirts of a world he wasn't welcome in? He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the cafe. The laughter, chatter, the clinking of glasses. No one cared. No one even noticed him. Yet, his gaze returned to Carl's spoon, now dipping closer to the soup. Josh's chest tightened. He hadn't imagined it. He had seen her pour something into the bowl. He knew what would happen if the old man took a bite. He didn't know Carl, but that didn't matter. Wrong was wrong. The moment stretched endlessly. And then, without thinking, Josh pushed himself off the railing. His legs felt heavy as lead, but he kept moving, marching straight to the table. "Don't eat that," he shouted, his voice cracking. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The clatter of a dropped fork echoed across the cafe. Carl froze, his spoon inches from his lips, his wide eyes locking onto the boy. Candy's head snapped around, her expression hardening into something cold and sharp. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice like a blade slicing through the stunned silence. Josh didn't falter. His voice shook, but he made sure everyone could hear him. "She put something in your food. I saw her. Don't eat it." Gasps rippled through the cafe as every patron turned their attention to the scene. The suffocating silence that followed seemed to draw all the air from the room. Josh stood firm, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through him. Carl blinked, his eyes darting between the boy and his wife. "Candy," he said, his tone calm but his hand trembling as he set the spoon down. "What is he talking about?" Candy's composure snapped like an overstretched rubber band. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "You little liar," she hissed, venom dripping from her words. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? Who even let you in here?" Her words stung, but Josh didn't back down. He kept his eyes locked on Carl, desperate to make him see the truth. "I saw her," Josh insisted, his voice steadying. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking. You can smell it if you don't believe me." Carl's face paled. He turned to Candy, his eyes narrowing. "Candy, what's going on?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Candy scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "He's just trying to cause trouble. Look at him. He probably wants money or food," she spat, her disdain for the boy obvious. But Josh didn't waver. He stepped closer to the table, his fists clenched. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice rising. "She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything." Carl's hand lingered over the bowl, torn between disbelief and the gnawing doubt creeping into his mind. Something in the boy's tone made him hesitate. The air around the table thickened, the once lively cafe now eerily silent. All eyes were locked on the unfolding drama, their meals forgotten. Carl leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze fixed on the boy. His face bore the weary lines of a man accustomed to people playing games to exploit his wealth. But this felt different. The boy didn't flinch or look away. "Josh, is it?" Carl asked, his voice steady, though a hint of suspicion lingered. Josh nodded. "Yes. I'm telling the truth. Please, don't eat it," he said softly, but his tone carried an unmistakable urgency. Candy let out a sharp, derisive laugh, crossing her arms as she glared at the boy. "This is absurd," she snapped, her tone icy. "He's just some street kid looking for attention. Are you really going to entertain this nonsense, Carl?" But Carl didn't answer her. Instead, he picked up the spoon again, this time bringing it closer to his face. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet storm brewing inside him. "Candy," he said slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You heard him. What exactly is going on here?" Candy's polished facade began to crack. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she retorted, "I can't believe you're even asking me that. It's insulting." She turned to the growing crowd, her voice rising. "He's lying. Look at him. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Why would you trust him over me?" Her words hung heavily in the air, but they didn't have the effect she had hoped for. The crowd murmured, their eyes darting between the three of them. Whispers floated through the cafe. "Did she really do it? She looks nervous. That boy doesn't seem like he's making this up." The murmurs only seemed to fuel Candy's fury. She slammed her hands on the table, her composure unraveling completely. "Enough of this, Carl. Eat your damn soup, and let's go, she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. But Josh wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, his fists clenched tightly. If you won't believe me, then call someone to test it, he urged, his voice rising. You're rich, you have lawyers, doctors, people who can figure it out. But don't eat it. If you do, you'll regret it. Carl's jaw tightened as he turned back to the bowl. The spoon was still in his hand, but he didn't lift it to his lips. His tired, calculating eyes shifted to Candy. Candy, he said, his voice low, you've been acting strange for weeks now. And this, her face flushed, and she stumbled over her words. I don't know what you're talking about. You can't seriously think I'd poison me? Carl finished for her, his tone razor-sharp. The crowd gasped audibly, their whispers growing louder. Josh stood firm, his gaze unwavering. His heart pounded, but he refused to show it. He had done what he could. Now it was up to Carl to make the next move. Candy straightened her posture, her expression hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. This is ridiculous. I don't have to sit here and listen to this nonsense, she said, grabbing her handbag. But before she could leave, Carl's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. Not until we get to the bottom of this. The waiter, who had been frozen in place, finally spoke up. Sir, should I call the police? The question sent a ripple through the cafe, and for the first time, Candy looked genuinely panicked. She shook her head violently. Don't you dare. This is just a misunderstanding. Carl, you can't seriously. But Carl raised a hand, silencing her. Yes, he said, addressing the waiter without looking away from Candy. Call them? Josh felt a surge of relief, though it was fleeting. The truth wasn't out yet, and the tension in the air was far from over. The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath as the waiter hurried inside to make the call. Carl released Candy's wrist, but his piercing gaze never left her. The once flawless charm she wore so effortlessly had unraveled, replaced by a growing sense of desperation. She glanced around, her lips moving silently, as if searching for an escape. Meanwhile, Josh stood a few steps back, his hands trembling slightly. He had done all he could, but doubt began to creep in. What if Carl didn't believe him after all? What if she managed to talk her way out of this? He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted in place. Josh, Carl said suddenly, his voice cutting through the thick tension, you said you saw her put something in the soup. Can you describe it? The boy nodded quickly and stepped forward. It was a small bottle, like the kind you'd use for medicine. Clear liquid. She poured it in when you were looking at your phone, then stirred it. I swear I saw it. Carl's face tightened as he turned to Candy, who was already shaking her head. This is absurd. He's lying. Why would I? But Carl cut her off. Why would he lie? What could he possibly gain from this? The crowd murmured again, and the distant sound of sirens only heightened the tension. Candy's eyes darted toward the soup, and for a split second, her carefully crafted facade crumbled. She looked cornered. Then, as if grasping at straws, she rounded on Josh. You've been spying on us, haven't you? Trying to cause trouble because you're jealous of people who actually have something. The words hit Josh like a slap, but he stood his ground. I'm not jealous, he said firmly. I saw what I saw, and I couldn't just stand there and let you hurt him. The sirens grew louder until 2 police officers entered the cafe. The room seemed to shrink as they approached the table, their hands resting on their belts. What's going on here? One of them asked, his tone neutral but authoritative. Carl stood, his towering frame still commanding respect despite his age. Officers, I need you to take a look at this, he said, gesturing toward the bowl of soup. This boy claims my wife poisoned it. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions carefully blank. One of them leaned down, sniffing the bowl cautiously, then turned to Candy. Ma'am, do you have anything to say about this? Her face turned crimson. This is ridiculous. He's just a street kid trying to make trouble. Carl, are you really going to let this nonsense go this far? But the officer wasn't swayed. We'll need to test the contents, he said, reaching for the bowl. No, Candy snapped, her voice rising. The sudden outburst drew even more attention, and her panic only made her look guiltier. The officer paused, narrowing his eyes. Ma'am, is there something you'd like to tell us before we proceed? Candy hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked at Carl, then at the officers, clutching her handbag with trembling hands. Finally, her resolve crumbled. Fine, she spat, her voice low but dripping with venom. You want the truth? I'm tired of living in his shadow, tired of his control over everything. He was never supposed to make it past this year, and I... She stopped abruptly, realizing too late that she'd said too much. The cafe erupted in gasps, some patrons pulling out their phones to record the scene. Carl's face went pale as the weight of her confession hit him like a truck. The officer stepped forward, his expression grim. Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder. Please put your hands where I can see them. Candy's composure shattered completely. She screamed, trying to wriggle free as they secured her hands behind her back. You don't understand. I deserved everything he had, everything, she shouted as they led her away, her voice echoing through the stunned cafe. Carl sank back into his chair, his hand trembling as he pushed the soup away. For a moment he said nothing, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. Then his eyes found Josh, who stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. As Carl's gaze softened, a flicker of gratitude replaced the anger in his expression. Josh hadn't just saved his life. He'd uncovered a truth Carl would never have seen coming. The cafe slowly returned to a low hum of whispers and murmurs as the officers escorted Candy out, her protests fading into the distance. Patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, still reeling from what they had just witnessed. Some looked at Carl with pity, others with curiosity. Josh remained rooted to the spot, unsure if he was supposed to stay or slip away quietly. Carl turned to the boy, his face still pale but his eyes steady. Josh, he said softly, gesturing to the seat across from him. Sit. Josh hesitated, glancing around at the onlookers, but Carl's voice carried a weight that compelled him to obey. Slowly, he sank into the chair, his shoulders tense. You saved my life, Carl said, his voice low but firm. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Josh fidgeted, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I couldn't let it happen, he said quietly. I couldn't just watch and say nothing. Carl nodded, his gaze distant for a moment, as if replaying the entire ordeal in his mind. Most people would have, he said after a pause. They would have turned the other way, pretended they didn't see. But you didn't. That took courage. Josh shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. I guess I don't like seeing people get hurt, that's all. Carl leaned back, studying the boy. For the first time he seemed to really see him, not just as a scrappy kid on the streets, but as someone with a story, a soul. How long have you been out here? The question caught Josh off guard. He looked away, his voice tinged with embarrassment. A while. Carl frowned, but didn't press. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. Wait here, he said, standing and stepping aside to make a call. Josh watched him, unsure of what to do. His heart pounded with anxiety. Was he in trouble now? Was Carl going to call someone to have him removed? When Carl returned, his expression was calm, almost kind. Help is on the way, he said simply. Help? Josh asked, his brow furrowing. Carl nodded. I called someone I trust. They'll make sure you have a place to sleep tonight. Somewhere safe. And if you'll let me, I'd like to do more than that. The boy's eyes widened. You don't have to do that, he said quickly, his voice defensive. I didn't do this for money or anything. Carl smiled faintly. I know. That's why I want to help you. You did something most people wouldn't have. And trust me, Josh, if the world had more people like you, it would be a much better place. For the first time in a long while, Josh felt a warmth he couldn't quite describe. He looked down, unsure of what to say. The cafe patrons began to disperse, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Carl picked up his glass of water, taking a long sip before speaking again. Sometimes life gives us the chance to change someone else's story, he said, his voice thoughtful. You changed mine today, Josh. And maybe, just maybe, I can help change yours. The boy glanced up at him, his dark eyes glistening with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. As the two sat in silence, the sun continued its arc across the sky, casting long shadows across the cafe. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the event. Courage doesn't always wear a suit, and kindness doesn't always come from the wealthy. Sometimes, it's the people we overlook who have the greatest strength of all. In the end, Josh's bravery didn't just save a life. It reminded everyone in that cafe of the power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. If this story touched you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more tales of courage, truth, and redemption. Share this video with someone who may need a reminder that even the smallest actions can create life-changing impacts.